Hi everybody, this is Margaret Denny and I'm here with Forrest Simons. We're at Simon Studio recording your lecture for Photo History 1. So this is the beginning. We're going to be talking about social documentary photography or the social sciences. And I miss seeing your faces, but I brought your picture with me so I can look at them and remember seeing you in class. So it's a poor substitute, but it's the best we can do right now. Anyway, welcome. So the first thing we want to talk about is what was going on in America at turn of the century, from the late 19th into the early 20th century. At turn of the century, the U.S. was experiencing a period of progressive social reform that permeated almost every layer of educated thought, ranging from social and educational theory to political reform in all levels of government. Hundreds of public and private agencies and organizations were established to confront the social problems arising from the new industrialized urban environment. So what we want to focus on today is how some of the new technologies that were available helped these photographers get their message out to a broader audience. And you'll hear the term halftone printing, and that was a way that a photograph could be rephotographed through a grid, which would have small dots and large dots. And through this grid, then printers would be able to print a photograph into text and have all the tonal ranges. So that's one term that will be coming up in our conversation. The other term that will be coming up in the conversation is the lantern slides. Now, lantern slides were a small glass plate, about 2.5 by 3.5 inches, and the photographer would print on that glass plate. They could be either in black and white, or they could be in color, and they would be hand-colored. But for our purposes today, these photographers were probably just printing in black and white and leaving it in black and white. Once they had it on the glass plate negative, not the glass plate negative, the glass plate, then an additional glass plate would go over it, and then it would be taped around the edges. These lantern slides would then be shown to broad audiences through the use of a projector. So again, lantern slides were a way that the social documentary photography were getting those messages out to a really large audience. Social documentary as a public record. Today we'll focus on two people who were really strong and historically important in this social reform photography. And one was Jacob Riis and one was Lewis Hine. And then we want to remember that at this moment it is the printing, the publications. So you've got Jacob Riis and Lewis Hine, photographers, but it's the publication and the availability of publication that makes things available to an audience. So in the 19th century, there were a lot of theories of origin. You may have heard of Darwin's origin of the species, which falls along the lines of different groups being categorized according to body type or other types. But there was another man whose name doesn't come out so frequently, and his name was Herbert Spencer. And his theory, known as Spencerian theme, was survival of the fittest. All who didn't make it weren't fit. It's a rather hard point to make, the fact that it sort of takes on the opinion that people don't care. So if you weren't fit, you just didn't make it. Well, that theory was then supplanted by the 1880s with the progressive era. And this was a new way of thinking. We must take action. We're concerned with what the industrial consumer capitalism has done to these people, and there's no social services to help them. So this is what the point that Jacob Riis and Lewis Hine were trying to make. There were photographers before this who were looking at the conditions of, say, the slums or people who did not have as much as other people. And one was Thomas Annan. He's working in Scotland and in Glasgow. And in particular, you're looking at two slides of what they call close. Close is sort of this term for an alleyway where there's tall buildings on either side. It did not let in much sunlight. You can see clothes kind of hanging from one building to the next, drying. Because it didn't let in much sunlight, this is sort of dangerous for people because you need more sunlight, you need more fresh air, and so this is sort of the point that Thomas Annan's photographs are making, that these might be areas where disease could grow and people just weren't as healthy. So we have Thomas Annan working in the 1860s, 1870s in Scotland, and we also have John Thompson. John Thompson did a whole survey of street life in London, and this was an album he made, 36 original photographs in the 1870s. And when we look at this one photograph, we see sort of a grandma type, and she's holding an infant on her lap, and she looks exhausted, like maybe she hasn't eaten in a long time. And there's a cup on the stoop next to her that people could put in an offering. So it's this type of drawing awareness to basically the haves and the have-not. And that's what these photographers are considering. I can't resist talking about an example of Chicago as an 1890 American city, very immigrant-oriented. By the 1890s, Chicago was the second largest city in the nation. It had 1 million residents. 78% of the population was foreign-born. In the 1880s, Chicago's population was 500,000, and by 1890, 1 million. So it grew at a tremendous rate. The first wave of immigrants in the mid-19th century were the Irish and Germans. And many of them were escaping poor food production, or in the case of the Germans, it was suppression by different political groups. The second wave came later in the century with the Italians, the Polish, the Greeks, Russian Jews. And they were either escaping, again, political situations, or they sought opportunities in America for better jobs. And by the early 20th century, we have a whole other group of immigrants, Mexican migrants, and African American migration from the South to the industrial North. So these social documentary photographers, in particular Jacob Riis, is contrasting the differences of other. So immigrant and ethnic groups against middle and upper class ideals. And in the case of Reese, he's doing it for a particular reason, which I'll get to shortly. So if you take immigrant and ethnic groups that may not have all the advantages of this middle and upper class, which is a proper world, work and home separate. So this upper middle class, these are these ideals that women's sphere is in the home, the woman is the nurturer, spiritual uplifter, the male is competent, he has work and he's successful, and then childhood is a time of innocence. They're living clean and orderly lives with plenty of space, air, and light. So here's a picture of Jacob Riis, and I have noted How the Other Half Lives, 1890, which is his publication. So Jacob Riis was born in Denmark, and he documented the living conditions in Lower East Side, New York City, and his intent was to bring about reform. He reached people through writing in newspapers, photographs that were published along with writing, and public lectures with glass slides, known as lantern slide lectures. And How the Other Half Lives started as a lantern slide lecture in 1888 and evolved into an article for Scribner's magazine and eventually was expanded and published as the important reform book, How the Other Half Lives, in 1890. So a little bit about Jacob Riis's background, his early history. He was one of the first persons to use photography as a tool for social reform. He was the son of a schoolmaster, and he immigrated to from Denmark in 1870. So he had that experience of being an immigrant. When he got to America in 1870, America was sinking into a depression, economic depression. He joined the thousands of poor, unskilled immigrants already in New York City. He was plagued by poverty during his early years in New York. Reese spent 7 years going from job to job. Once he walked to Philadelphia seeking a job from a Danish family he knew. In Denmark, he had had some experience preparing copy for his father. This experience helped him get a job as a news reporter. So Reese's position evolved into being a police reporter for the New York Tribune and later the New York Evening Sun. This situation exposed him to the squalor of the slums of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Outraged at what he saw, Reese sought to bring about reforms. His writings about unsanitary and inhumane conditions began to elicit change. The establishment of the city's first tenement house commission, but that wasn't enough. So we could consider that he became the first social documentary photography and photojournalist, so it kind of combines things. So these are some of the situations that Reese saw in the Lower East Side. This is called the Bend, and when you look at it, you see the crowded conditions. Again, it's packed with people, and sort of they've got their goods out on the sidewalk, and there are carriages, and so this is what he's delving into. But with Reese, Reese has some strategies. First, his titles. He has sort of titles that are degrading and shocking. So that's one thing that he employs, and he definitely illustrates his words with these pictures. So Reese's images were published initially using the woodblock print method, which meant that an artist would convert his photograph into a woodblock print. But that didn't have that same sort of oomph that a photograph with its reality would necessarily have. And so then he was able to incorporate this halftone printing that I mentioned earlier. The public thought his photographs were objective and completely truthful, and the images made Reese's words more effective. So here we see one of his examples. It's called Baxter Street Alley in Mulberry Bend, 1888. And I just want you to look at it for a minute, and we'll see it in comparison with an image that you saw at the Art Institute. So here we see kind of that dark alleyway that we saw in Scotland with Annan's photographs and with clothes hanging drying. And then we see these two sort of innocent young women, young girls even. They're posed obviously next to their dwelling, but in the back we see 3 to 5 sort of strange looking men that look a little ominous. So it's just posing this sort of innocence against this maybe dangerous element. And I think this is something that Reese was trying to get. So the closeness of the building shut out the light of day. He's exploiting the icons of innocence, Victorian society, with the child having this iconic moment of innocence, particularly these girls who could easily be damaged. And I want you to think about this a minute as we set this against an image that you saw at the Art Institute. This is set against Gertrude Käsebeer's Manger, where we see the soft focus, the white garment, the mother caring gently for her young infant, sort of comparing this harshness, this harsh scene on the left with this soft, ideal moment of innocence on the right. So this is what Reese wanted to do. He wanted to scare people. And when he had these lectures, he invited upper class people to the lecture. And the whole idea was that he wanted to scare them. He wanted to say, if we don't clean this up, if we don't get this taken care of, this disease, this danger easily will come into your neighborhood. And he talks about this a lot, which it's sort of interesting, his whole point of this. He's showing you that there's this thin wall that exists between the haves and the have-nots. Because as we know, disease has no boundaries. It just hops right over from one neighborhood to the next. So this is what he's trying to do, because he's scaring people, talking about ideas of the smallpox and the cholera and the tuberculosis that was rampant at this time. And he wanted to emphasize to this middle and upper class, we must eradicate this disease, save the world to save yourself. And as a result of this, he got people to take action. They started the New York Sanitary and Health Service and many other groups that came together to try to make some action. So here we have another photograph here called Bandit's Roost. And this was in the book, How the Other Half Lives, where we see 14 people staring at us. It's a dead-end alley. No way out. We are unwelcome. And there's a man with his sort of beating stick. And on each side of the alley are stale beer dives in room after room where the stuff is sold for 2 to 3 cents a quart. Now, a man in Chicago said, "The gang is a distemper of slums. A friend come to tell us that something has gone amiss in our social life." And this is a quote from Wallace Kirkland, his thesis on gangs. Wallace Kirkland worked at the Jane Addams Hull House Museum. He was a photographer here in Chicago. And he would be documenting similar things, we'll say. So here we go with Reese moving into areas where people are actually working, but it's more like not, how should we say, not perfect environmental conditions. So here we have a boy picking thread, and also sometimes called a downtown morgue. It's a sweatshop system. We see a big pile of work. The child is torn from his family. He's a 10-year-old. And Reese shot this at the vantage point at the child's feet, making the adults look more ominous. And here we have a scene that I think Reese was trying to make a connection, sort of a metaphor here. So we have what's called the Italian mother in the home of an Italian rag picker on Jersey Street. This was in Reese's book. So the mom is with her child, and she's in a basement setting. I didn't ever realize this was a basement, but you can see the stairs, rickety kind of wooden stairs. But she's looking upward, and there is a hat hanging on the wall. This could also be part of that metaphor. She's almost equated to the metaphor of a Madonna and child. So this is an Italian mother. She's poor, she's desperate, but she works hard. She cleans the rags, piles of rags. She picks through for new cloth. The bed is folded up and just parked on a barrel, but the linens are still white. So it's trying to show, I think, some hope, and her looking up almost heavenly or heaven-bound might indicate that she's seeking help, seeking a better life even. So this ladder that we see, it also sort of a metaphor toward heaven, elevation upward. It's a motif. He poses them so the audience makes this connection. So how did Reese, this is another term that we'll be thinking about briefly, but how did Reese get into these places and take photographs so you can see what was going on? He began to use magnesium flash. Reese noticed an ad in the paper for magnesium flash as a way to take pictures at night. With a few sympathizers, a Dr. John Nagel, Bureau of Vital Statistics in the Health Department, and a Dr. Henry Pifford, and another fellow, two accomplished and progressive amateur photographers, they formed night raiding parties to document the conditions of the slums of the Lower East Side. In the beginning, Reese did not take any pictures. Later, when his friends abandoned him, because granted they didn't want to go out every night and take pictures, Reese hired a photographer, but this person was selling the photographs behind his back. He decided to take the photographs himself, and soon he began making the photographs, determining what vantage point and arrangement of people best suited his cause. So this gives us an idea of an image made specifically, noted for its bright light from magnesium flash. It's a family doing piecework. So when you think about this, there's always a middleman, right? So these people are making objects, and then somebody comes and picks them up and then takes them somewhere, and that person gets money for the pieces, right? So the family just gets a little token bit of money, and the middleman gets the bigger portion. So with this this image, we see the mother and the father and the small boy working, and the small child looks like they're just kind of hanging there, hoping that there might be a break in the work, so they have a little attention. But just to speak again about the magnesium flash, it was dangerous to operate. Twice, Reese set fires to the buildings that he was trying to photograph in, and once he set fire to himself. His spectacles saved him from becoming blind. His raiding partners abandoned him just when he really needed them. He also, how should we say, collaborated with some of the local kids. This one's called Street Arabs, Night Boys in Sleeping Quarters. And I think that although he's making a point that some kids might not have had a bed to sleep in or just a sort of a mattress on the floor, these boys, I think, are enjoying enacting the scene that they're sleeping outdoors. You can sort of see little grins on their face, and I think that they're sort of enjoying this narrative that they've been asked to help with. This is a gang of boys. It's called the Montgomery Gang, and it's titled Growler, Montgomery Gang in Session. So the Growler boys were the ones that got the stale beer. So they got the stale beer and either resold it or tested it for themselves. And this is one I've always found very difficult. It's called Kti Scrubs. And we see this lone little girl against a wall. And if you look at her outfit, she's got a coat over her dress, but the sleeves of the coat look rather short. And the coat itself is a little short, perhaps of course it's a hand-me-down. But I think the thing that is so heartbreaking about this picture is that she identifies only with the fact that she scrubs. And I think Reese drives this point home. We don't know what her family situation is. We don't know who takes care of her. We don't know where she sleeps at night or where she eats. It's an unknown. Another photograph that tells you that these children weren't leading what we would consider, and what people in the day were considering, to be normal childhood lives. So here's this young girl, and she's minding the baby. It's called Minding Baby Cherry Hill. And you can't help but look at the child, the baby, and think that that baby doesn't look entirely well. It might have a fever, but there again, this young woman, this young girl, that is her job, to watch the baby while the mother has to do something out and work. Reese continues to show us scenes in the city, and here we have one of the playground and establishment in Poverty Gap. So he's showing the kids playing. They do have some play equipment, but it isn't the nice sort of grassed area or updated equipment that we see in the parks now. It's a little ragged. And then when he gets to this subject, it becomes, I think, the most difficult for him and for the people that witness these, because I don't think it's something that we knew about. It's about police station lodging. And so people that were homeless and didn't have a place to sleep could go to police stations, and you can see this is one for women, and they're all kind of clustered around all together. Again, sleeping next to each other, it could be a little dangerous from a health standpoint. There is no mattress in this case. They're just on the floor, no pillows. It's really quite difficult. So he was really concerned about the conditions here. And then we had the men's lodging room, and this is at the West 47th Street station. We had crowded, unsanitary, no privacy. He did, and this one is particularly, I think, difficult because you see on the upper left this pile of wood that would be used to, of course, heat the room, but the pile of wood looks like at any moment it could come crashing down on top of these people. You see in the middle left, you see people kind of on tables or mock tables, and their bare feet are sticking out, and other people crowded right next to each other. It's very tight quarters. Reese acquired, how should we say, support from Theodore Roosevelt, who was then a civil service commissioner, and he wrote to Reese, "I have read your book and I have come to help." The two became friends. Roosevelt references Reese in his autobiography of 1913. So because of drawing attention to this police lodging houses, the city of New York abolished that practice, and the city government began making frequent visits to tenement regions, and Roosevelt, when he was governor of New York, a while later, tried to improve upon the sweatshop labor system. So just to give you a little example of a couple more images that Reese incorporated into his talks, and using these very, how should I say, shocking titles perhaps, 5 cents a spot, Bayard Street Tenement. I'm just going to show you quickly how it appeared in his book. So this one isn't the halftone, this is just made into an engraving. But I think it gets the point across. And when we see this picture, you can notice that a few of the people are still sleeping, but most of them have been aroused by that magnesium flash that went off and kind of startled everybody. But here again, people are side by side, kind of on cheap mattresses. Everything is rather crude and just pulled together rather shoddily. If any of the pictures that he showed, if they didn't reach their audience, it wasn't because Reese didn't give them impact or difficult titles. This one's called Cave Dweller. And this man has lodging in a cellar for $4 a month. So Reese's titles underscored the degradation of the inhabitants of the slums. A man sleeping in a cellar becomes a cave dweller. So the goal of the pictures was to make you feel you were shocked. And he wanted the audience to show the moral bankruptcy, forcing together two social systems, the haves and haves not, and the thin wall that exists between the two halves. So this would have been part of his lantern slide view, part of his lecture series, and it was an important moral ethical event. When you look at this picture, first of all, the man has this rolled up mattress that looks very dirty, very stained. He's probably been shocked awake by the magnesium flash, but you can't help but thinking he's in a cellar and there's sort of garbage down below, or at least trash of some sort. And I don't know about you, but I can't help but think there might have been mice or rats or something. And that's why he's up on these barrels. But it's a very shocking image. So Reese, through something like this, his goal was to talk to the middle class, the middle and upper class, and to get that idea across that we have to eradicate these living conditions and eradicate the disease that might be incurred because of these living conditions. Save the world to save yourself. He also showed some rather, again, sort of sad situations of people who were very, very poor, and then they were just buried in unmarked graves in what was called Potter's Field. It was for the burial for the poor. And so they wouldn't have a marker, they wouldn't have a specific funeral or any observance. It was just that their bodies were buried. And he also shows this black and tan dive bars, which he considered maybe to be places that, again, were not the best for society, we'll say. So Reese's aim was to show pictures that were scary, offensive, and to reject the niceties of Victorian pictorialism. He showed his audience fear with Bandit's Roost, empathy with the Italian mother as a Madonna, and then the two little innocent girls in Baxter Alley. Reese's commitment was to families and social and economic change. He does show in his lectures what can happen if society takes control, and this he shows a couple of the settlement house programs, and this is one settlement house program in New York, the House of Industry, and this one as well, Prayer Time at 5 points. So that's another. There were all these settlement houses which were created. Chicago had about 4 of them at the time, around the 1890s, and New York had several as well. So these are where children would stay if they needed this type of help, which so many of them did. And they would be clean, they would get education, they would have food. The second person we're going to focus on is Lewis Hine. And Lewis Hine was in Chicago for a while. He was from Wisconsin originally, but he came down to the University of Chicago and had some progressive education with John Dewey. John Dewey was connected with Jane Addams Hull House, And so Lewis Hine ended up coming at one time to Chicago and photographing the settlement house, Hull House. And if any of you are interested, Hull House still exists. It's over on Halsted Street, 800 Halsted Street, Harrison and Halsted. And there's a museum there, and you can see what type of programs were put together. So all that's left now are 2 buildings, but at the time I think there were about 75 buildings, and it encompassed a whole area where UIC currently is. And this settlement house offered, they offered training in different, different, I don't know if you'd call it, maybe people would learn sewing, or they would learn sort of how to do other carpentry work, but there were also sports, and children had activities. There were the arts, music, so theater. So they tried to offer a lot of programs for the people that lived in the area right around where UIC currently is. So Lewis Hine ended up moving to New York in 1904, and he became a teacher at the Ethical Cultural School, where he actually kind of taught himself to be a photographer. He trained with a 5x7 view camera, and he organized the school camera club, and he used photography to tell a story, a social description, a formal description of what the world was like at that moment. And part of the school's teaching program, he began to take pictures of immigrants. So immigrants at Ellis Island, the entry port into the United States for millions of immigrants at turn of the century. By 1907, 5,000 people were coming in a day, and he continued to photograph at Ellis Island until 1909 and returned after he became a professional photographer. Paul Strand was one of Lewis Hine's students, and he would take him down to Ellis Island, sort of like a field trip. And when we get to Paul Strand, you'll see where there might be a connection. So this is one of Lewis Hine's, I think, early works down at Ellis Island. An Italian family seeking luggage, 1905. And it's quite, I think, endearing. We see a mother, and we see 2 younger daughters, and then we see a boy. The mother looks rather wary of having her picture taken. I think the boy looks a little excited almost. Maybe he's excited for the idea of coming to America. But they've just gone off of a rather long ocean voyage, and they're in the process of getting settled, getting their luggage. Lewis Hine showed everyone he photographed with dignity, and I think this one is particularly interesting. This is on Ellis Island. It's a woman with a shawl, 1906. I mean, his portraits are very kind of emotional. You're drawn into this person, you look into their eyes, and you almost feel what they're feeling. So he did some really, I think, wonderful photographs of immigrants arriving in America. And this one, a young Russian Jewess on Ellis Island, 1905, and she does look rather scared. She has just left Russia at a time when there were pogroms and political difficulties for Jewish people in Russia. So they were escaping something very difficult there, but coming to America, I'm sure, was a little bit daunting as well. And then the long trip. So what did Lewis Hine do after Ellis Island? So at this moment, turn of the century, this is a period of the progressive social reform, or the progressive era, it's the easiest to remember, and it did permeate every area of society, social, education, political. in America. And a number of agencies began to be formed to make changes, some on an international scope, such as the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. How did Lewis Hine's work get out there so the public could see what he was trying to illustrate? His works appeared in many magazines, one called Survey magazine, and here they would have been shown in this half-tone printing, where the photograph in all of its tonal ranges appeared alongside the text. So extremely showing reality. So educators, agencies, and organizations wanted to document their charitable and social activities. People wanted to show what they're trying to do to help, and the popular press provided an active market for social concern documentary photographers. Hine had gotten a degree in education from New York University in 1905, but he gave up this relatively secure position as a teacher for a life as a documentary photographer. After Ellis Island, Hine documented tenement life in New York City and other East Coast cities. And he also worked for the Charities and the Commons magazine and for the National Child Labor Committee. I'm going to show you a couple slides now that really focus on his attention to children, and I think, well, I don't know, I find this quite endearing. And so Lewis Hine, he followed boys that had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go sell newspapers, and you have this picture just called Newsboy 1909, and it's kind of interesting, the juxtaposition of this rather well-dressed lady who's moving off to the left. She sees the photographer, but she seems very distant from anything else that's going on. She doesn't see the boy. But the boy walks toward us, the viewer, and he's got this sort of, he's got verve, he's got attitude. He's a strong little guy, and I think it really shows here. And Lewis Hine has him centered right in the photograph, and the lines of the sidewalk kind of point to him. And as she goes off into the distance, ignoring him. And then we see this other boy selling newspapers in Connecticut, 1909. So Hine is making images for exhibitions, lectures, and a wide variety of publications. And he does instinctively understand the persuasive power of photographs to illustrate his point. And so here we have this boy selling newspapers, and he looks kind of tired, like he probably has been up for hours, and no one's buying his newspaper right now, so he's decided to sit down. And then we have two businessmen on either side of him that are sort of ignoring him. It makes its point. So Lewis Hine takes on some other major jobs. He gets a commission to go to and conduct what's called the Pittsburgh Survey, and he does that from 1909 to 14, and where he gets the conditions not only of these breaker boys that we see, the boys who break up the coal and break it apart from the shale. And it's a rather dangerous job. They sit there and the coal's going through rather fast, and it's dusty. They're ingesting coal dust, which is not healthy. And some of them have been known to fall down into the chute. Very dangerous work. So he's got a lot of work here to do. So he is making these photographs, documenting children at work, on farms and in factories, textile mills, and mines. So the Pittsburgh Survey. And then he photographs other immigrant types. This is a Slavic coal worker or coal miner, 1910. So showing a type of an immigrant worker. But in his photographs, as I said, he respects the individual, and he tries to show this, I think, in his work. They're not scary necessarily, but they're unnerving. So Lewis Hine headed south and entered areas where there was manufacturing of fabric, and here he wasn't really welcomed into the factories because, let's face it, the factory owners were hiring cheap labor, children of many different ages, and they were working with rather difficult machinery that was quite large and at times dangerous. So Lewis Hine pretended he was there to photograph only the machinery, and he would set his camera up and make it look like he was photographing the machinery, which he was, but he planned it so there would be a child in the picture doing work, and you would see that vast difference between the large machinery and the small child. He would also carry a notebook with him, and when it was handy, and when the owners weren't around, he would ask questions about how old the children were and how long they'd been working in this position. So this first one is Child, Carolina Cotton Mill, 1908. The reason he knew that so many people were, or so many factories had hired children, he would hide out and watch them go in and out over lunch hour. And so he knew which places he would have material. He was very outraged about the conditions that he photographed, and that the sight of a 5-year-old child working in 12-hour days in unsafe and sanitary factories offended him and roused his sympathy. So I think with a picture like this, the Child, Carolina Cotton Mill, we see it almost as beautiful because he has made it beautiful. The light coming in through the windows casts this beautiful sort of, it opens it up. It's not dark and scary like Reese's photographs, but still we notice that difference between the child and the large machinery. And like I said, he would inquire, in this particular one, child labor, I think you almost see her imploring his help. For some reason, she looks like she is imploring his help. And in this case, she had been working here, I want to say, about 6 years, and she was 12 years old. But again, he never presented his subjects as victims. He allowed them to face the camera on their own terms, to present their own sense of self, no matter what the circumstances. But still, you see large machinery, small child. What Lewis Hine was able to accomplish, the government did finally make a ruling that children under 14, unless it was under extreme circumstances that they had to support the family, that they wouldn't be working. That did change at one point when America entered another war, and men were pulled away from the factories, and then children were brought back in to factory work. But Lewis Hine was able to get a lot of public attention and awareness, and governmental controls were changed due to his work. The project that he moved to next, and this was between World War I and II, there was a movement in the visual arts to portray the benefits of the thriving industrial capitalism in America. And I think here he shows it nicely with this powerhouse mechanic, and we see the beautiful steel and the light of the steel that reflects nicely in this photograph, and then how he's captured the curve of the machinery and the curve of the mechanic's body. It's just very rhythmic and beautiful. So that's one project that he was working on, and this turns into a book, and it's called Men at Work. So The other commission that Hine received was the Empire State Building, and he received the commission from labor unions and industry to photograph the construction of the Empire State Building. So he went up in these elevators, and we see strong graphic forms, and it's beautifully modern in a way because it's steel beams and quite exciting. And this was published in Europe and in America as the book Men at Work, and we see one more shot of it. It's pretty exciting, and I think this is at a time when maybe America needs a little boost and needs to feel like it's progressing and progressive. So I'm going to just turn briefly to two people that were also showing their work in newspaper format or magazine format, or at least Frances Benjamin Johnston was, because she was hired as a photojournalist. Her work isn't the progressive era hardcore work of Reese and Hine, but it was informative. It did tell a story and informed middle class what was going on in work worlds. So Frances Benjamin Johnston also went to the mines. She went to the Coronor mines in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. She was commissioned to do that by Demorest magazine, and she photographed using magnesium flash to provide light. So this is an example of that, and according to her records, it took 4 hours to produce 3 negatives to her liking. And then Johnston also visited coal miners in their homes, where she interviewed them, photographed and interviewed them, and produced the article Through the Coal Country with a Camera, and that was published in Demorest magazine, March 1892. So when we think of Frances Benjamin Johnston, we'll think of photojournalism the whole way. This is another photograph that she made, probably of a ship coming into Ellis Island. It's the SS Amsterdam, 1899, where she shot immigrants from Europe. And her work, rather than purely for reform purposes, it was used for her documentary photographs for publications in journals, magazines, and books. In this particular situation, she was commissioned to make about 28 photographs for an article, The Woman That Tolls. It was published in Everybody's Magazine in 1902. This was taken earlier in Lynn, Massachusetts at a shoe factory. So the article talks about the conditions for women in wage labor. And then one more photograph from this series, the shoe factory in Lynn, Massachusetts. I didn't say this, but obviously her photographs are not harsh. The conditions don't reveal that they're difficult. Perhaps married with the text, you find out more about the conditions of these women. Granted, they're working in different conditions. This isn't the ideal middle class, but still, they're wage workers, and the conditions were not terrible. Another commission that Johnston received, and maybe not a lot of people know about this, but she was, in 1900, she was commissioned to photograph the Hampton Institute. So the Hampton Institute was a school that was opened in 1868, right after the American Civil War, and it was a mission to prepare, it had a mission to prepare African-American youths for jobs in the trades and agriculture. And these images were part of an exhibition at the International Exposition Universelle in Paris, 1900. And they're rather formal and perfect, you know, but it's still informative. And not only were they on exhibit at this major international fair in Paris, but they were also used for publications in America. And so we see one image and then a few others. These were all gelatin silver prints, and it gives you an idea of the type of, people making bricks, a history class, a woman's sewing class, and then it looks like a geography class where they've all got little earths that they're globes, we'll say. So this was an important commission for her, and as I said, she not only photographed the actual school, it was a boarding school, but she also went and photographed some people in the home, and then she was asked to do another commission. This was the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She did this from 1900 to 1903, which was a similar type of boarding school. There's sort of issues with this because apparently some of the children were brought from the West, and they had been on reservations, and maybe they didn't really want to be apart from their family, but it's still sort of historically important information, tells us, what was going on, and kind of they are opportunities that once the child graduated from the school, from this boarding school, then they would have greater opportunities out in the world. One other person, and I'm only just mentioning this briefly to you, is Alice Austen. And Alice Austen lived in Staten Island, and she's an amateur photographer, and her work should not be considered for reform at all. It's just more informative. She photographed her family, friends, and picnics, and she was from a wealthy family. But once a ferry was made available, a ferry from Staten Island to Manhattan, she probably had heard that the Lower East Side was an interesting place. So she took her camera there in the 1880s, and she photographed kids on the street selling goods, or somebody that was carrying their products in wagons. This woman on the lower left, she's selling eggs. So she's documenting working people and immigrants of varied ethnic backgrounds. And she's really kind of photographing it, I think, in more of a positive way and an informative way. These photographs were not intended for reform purposes, but and these photographs, 3,500 of the negatives are in the Staten Island Historical Society, so they are available. And on Canvas website, there is a link to her work, that to a video that might be interesting for you to follow up with. So that brings our social reform photography, or social documentary, to a close. If any of you have questions about this, or questions about the particular terms that were mentioned, I have posted a list of photographic terms, and that might give you a little bit more information about things like halftone and things like the magnesium flash and the lantern slides. So any questions, please don't hesitate to get hold of us. We miss you already, and look forward to seeing you sometime soon, and we will meet again in the next lecture.